And welcome back to the Dark Reading News Desk at Black Hat USA. Terry Sweeney here, contributing editor with Dark Reading, and joining us now is Suresh Vasudevan, CEO of Sysdig. Suresh, nice to see you here.
Great to see you. Thank you for having me.
We are talking about cloud security, a subject near and dear to your heart.
Indeed.
Last year, Sysdig set the benchmark for cloud threat detection and response. Tell us about this 555 benchmark and why that's important.
Of course, maybe I'll begin with just starting by describing what's so different about attacks in the cloud from attacks on-prem.
Sure.
And we all see the fact that attacks in the cloud are growing in frequency, but what's really insidious about cloud threats in general and cloud breaches is the fact that once cybercriminals make their way into your cloud estate, the speed at which the attacks progress is unprecedented. So across hundreds of cloud attacks, what our threat research teams have seen is that typically, once there's an insertion into the cloud, it takes about 10 minutes or less before they're able to conduct reconnaissance, do lateral movement, and then get to an exploit. And so that's sort of the challenge that really security teams face in the cloud is, given that I have minutes within which to detect and respond to an attack, how do I really do my job as an analyst? And that's where the 555 benchmark comes in, Terry. It's really articulating a standard for what detection and response in the cloud should aim for, which is you really have 5 seconds in which to detect a breach that's underway, 5 minutes to triage really what's happening as you see the symptoms of an attack, and then 5 minutes within which to respond. And that's a daunting challenge for today's SOC teams.
Well, and I thought my deadlines were tough. This sounds really, really anxiety producing.
Indeed it is. And you know, part of this is a recognition that the entire mindset of how, given such a narrow window of time, do I need to rethink the tooling that I have in place within my SOC itself? How do I get to a point where I can rapidly triage when I see something that's going wrong? And that's really the challenge, and I'll touch a little bit more on sort of what it takes to address that, but that's absolutely a daunting challenge for cloud teams.
Time really is of the essence. No, that's
Indeed.
Great context.
Indeed.
Thanks for that. So customers in general are at various stages of cloud adoption. There seem to have been two fundamentally different approaches to cloud securities that customers are split between. Tell us about what these two approaches are and how they're different.
Yeah, so when I started by articulating the fact that you have roughly 10 minutes after an insertion into the cloud to stop an attack, the first question you want to think about is, how do I prevent insertion into the cloud in the first place? So really the first focus in cloud security tends to be, how do I put good prevention, good hygiene, good guardrails in place? How do I make sure that I don't have vulnerabilities in my software supply chain, that I'm not misconfiguring my cloud, whether it's permissions or other things? How do I make sure I have good hygiene on identities and how entitlements work? So that's really the first aspect of cloud security, is how do I have good risk management in the cloud? Now the second aspect of cloud security stems from the fact that no matter how well I do at prevention, people are going to find their way in. I have to be able to also detect and respond to attacks when someone makes their way into the cloud. So detection and response is the second aspect of cloud security. I would not think of these as two separate aspects as much as complementary.
Sure.
You need both.
Yeah, right. It's
Indeed.
not either or.
Exactly.
That being said, do customers tend to emphasize one over the other? I'm guessing prevention is a bigger
That's
thing.
Right. That's right, and I think naturally so. When I wear the hat of a CISO, one of the things, especially, we are used to thinking about the cloud journey as extremely mature, well underway, and yet I would say for most companies, they're still early in the deployment of cloud security solutions, and the very first question that a security team thinks about is, do I have visibility into what's in my cloud? Am I making sure that I'm doing things the right way and having guardrails in place? Am I making sure that I'm scanning for vulnerability? So I think prevention and managing your risk posture in the cloud often tends to be the first phase of adoption of the cloud. The second phase tends to be, I've taken really good care of all my preventive controls, of my hygiene factors. I now have to make sure it is a given that I'm going to have attacks in my cloud, and I can't escape without having really good detection and response tools, because I run the risk of attacks in that event. And so both are, so it's almost a sequence of how people approach, I think, how they approach cloud security overall.
Makes total sense. Like most smart vendors, Sysdig has its own threat research team.
Indeed.
Talk about some of the the data that they're seeing, where they're seeing attacks originate, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so we are extremely proud of the threat research team. They have uncovered numerous threat actors, hundreds of attacks that they study, and so there are a few themes that emerge from the work that they've done. The first thing I would say is when we look at most attacks that originate, I already touched on perhaps the most important finding, which is the dwell time in the cloud is measured in minutes, where dwell time on-premise is measured in days. That to me was the most groundbreaking sort of finding that's now been articulated by many other threat research teams as well. The next thing that we've really seen as a pattern is, also touch on two other patterns. The second one being, when you look at sort of what are typical insertion points into the cloud, there seem to be three roads that are three pathways that consistently are used to break into the cloud in the first place. Vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, and permissions, either through sort of social engineering, you get someone's credentials, or some other mechanism. Credentials are a starting point for most attacks. Now, the third observation that I'll make that's the most interesting pattern we've seen, which leads to the short dwell time, is that once someone is in, the very automation that DevOps teams and CloudOps teams are relying on to more efficiently run cloud infrastructure is essentially what attackers use to rapidly understand what weaknesses exist once they get in. And then identity is almost always the common denominator of how lateral movement occurs. And so that's really what you want to focus on. The exploit is the last step. How do you really understand when there's malicious reconnaissance and malicious lateral movement happening within your cloud infrastructure? Can you detect that? That will enable you to respond faster.
Wow, okay. I wanted to ask you about comparisons with on-prem versus cloud attacks. Tell us about maybe the biggest misconceptions about how cloud threats are different from on-prem attacks. I think there may be, at least to a newcomer, the idea that an attack is an attack, but from what you're describing, especially with the dwell time,
indeed,
these are really different threats and have very different urgency about them. Talk about how security teams have to address this dichotomy.
Absolutely. I think if I think about maybe the fundamental differences, let me approach this from the point of view of how do I respond to the attack. I've already touched a little bit on what's different about cloud attacks, but if I think about what are the capabilities that we need in order to respond to attacks in the cloud, the first thing I would say is because time is so precious, your detection happens to the time to detection is really important. So the question it begs is, how do I detect something malicious in the cloud? Now, one important aspect is to look for workload anomalies. So someone's uploading malware, someone's making a malicious network connection. This is something we're all familiar with. We see that on endpoints. The same needs to happen on cloud endpoints, containers, servers, etc. But it's not enough because that's literally the last step from which you have very little time to recover. So how do I understand that it's on the way to being exploited? This is really where data sources are different. And so you need to make sure that you have the ability to gather cloud activity. So how do I use APIs to understand someone just created a new EC2 machine, someone opened up an S3 bucket without turning encryption on, someone just changed their privileges within Cloud IAM. Am I able to track activity in the cloud? Separately, am I able to track identity behavior in the cloud? So when someone does a lateral movement, I logged into a resource from a location that's unusual, that kind of identity behavior. So you need to correlate identity behavior, cloud activity, workload activity, and do that in real time. To me, that is perhaps the most foundational challenge of how do cloud attacks behave differently. It's multitude of data sources that need to be correlated in real time. You don't have the luxury of waiting to store those in a SIEM and then respond.
Sure. Thanks for that. It wouldn't be Black Hat. It wouldn't be a conversation about cloud security without also bringing in AI to the mix. Talk to us about whether AI is more of a challenge or opportunity for security
Indeed.
teams. Again, this isn't an either-or thing, but real briefly now, what can you tell us there?
Yeah, I think, as you know, it's both, as all of us know, it's both.
Sure.
I think on the challenge side, for me, the biggest challenge is the use of shadow AI. In the already, if you think about the hundreds of services to thousands of services, it's really hard for a security team to know which of those microservices has an AI library, an ML library embedded, is making API calls to SageMaker, and so on, right? So do I even know where my development teams are embedding AI and therefore making me vulnerable to data access and so on and so forth. So I think the rise of shadow AI and not having visibility is probably the greatest challenge that people have to overcome. Besides putting all the security controls in place, lack of visibility is probably the greatest challenge. On the opportunity side, I am extremely excited about how much you can leverage AI to make security engineers not just 50% more productive, 80% more productive, 3 times, 4 times more productive. We've introduced an AI assistant that is game-changing in the ability to rapidly detect and respond to threats. And so I think that's where the opportunity is greatest, to make people far more productive, I think.
Suresh Vasudevan of Sysdig, thank you so much for walking us through the finer points of cloud security. I appreciate you joining us on News Desk.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.